Written 5 novels, some of which include Mass Transit, On Air, Stay With Me, and A Matter of Detail. She writes fiction and essays as a Monday columnist for 3corksdaily.com and has contributed essays for the monthly magazine Herald, including an essay on Pakistan's English fiction. Maniza Naqvi's book, A Guest in the House, is a memoir which chronicles her time at the Pioneer Book House, Karachi, and provides a lens into the history of the city. She is also the founder and CEO of the Little Book Company, a startup publisher and e-books digital platform for publishers, authors, and booksellers. Please give them a big hand.
Good afternoon. I am as excited, or maybe more excited than you are, to welcome Hanif Kureishi, who in my opinion is the badass, brilliant bard of Britain. He's the modern bard of Britain who burst onto the literary scene in 1984 with My Beautiful Laundrette and changed the narrative of Britain forever. I should have introduced him as, his name is Hanif Kureishi, and he's an Englishman, born and bred.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Hanif, with that introduction, I'm going to go through the list of all your works as we talk, but not right now. But what I'd like to do is have Hanif read from his first novel, The Buddha of Suburbia, which caught all our imaginations. And I will ask him to read the first paragraph, and then please hand this back to me.
I'm just looking on here, Maniza. I can see you got some very naughty questions on here. I'm going to scribble them out. But Maniza wants me to read from my own book. This is the first paragraph of the book. Of course, as you can imagine, I wrote the first paragraph after I'd finished the book. The book actually started further down the page, and I thought it needed, let's say, a more dramatic opening. So here we go. My name is Karim Amir, and I'm an Englishman born and bred, almost. I'm often considered to be a funny kind of Englishman, a new breed, as it were, having emerged from 2 old histories. But I don't care. I'm an Englishman, though I'm not proud of it, from the South London suburbs, and I'm going somewhere. Perhaps it's the odd mixture of continents and blood, of here and there, of belonging and not, that makes me restless or easily bored. Or perhaps it was being brought up in the suburbs that did it. Anyway, why should I search the inner room when it's enough to say that I was looking for trouble? Any kind of trouble, any kind of movement and sexual interest I could find, because things were so gloomy, so heavy in our family, and I can't tell you why that was. Quite frankly, it was all getting me down, and I was ready for anything. Then, one day, everything changed. In the morning, things were one way, and by bedtime, they were another. I was 17 years old. Woo.
Your water's right here and there. Oh. You're surrounded by water.
Good.
So let's take it from there.
Okay.
You were born and bred in Bromley?
I'm not the only notable person to come from Bromley, I have to tell you that. Bromley is a terrible suburb, just outside London. It's a terrible place. I would recommend that you would never go there. Or if you do, in the old days, when you went from London to Paris on the Eurostar, you would pass through London in a flash on the train. And when I passed through Bromley, I would always raise my finger as I passed through on my way to Paris to give it my greetings. But I have to say, in those days, I'm talking about the 1960s, although the suburbs of Bromley, it was a really dull place, it was also very creative. There were a lot of young musicians came out of Bromley in the 60s and 70s. And a lot of my friends from school got involved in fashion photography. They became musicians. They later worked in film and television and so on. So although it was terrible, it wasn't only terrible because at that time, at the end of the 60s and the 70s, we had what was called social mobility. So the kids like us, who were not expected ever to be anyone or achieve anything, during that great period of pop, we were able to get out and lead creative lives.
So name us a couple of names other than yourself who came out of Bromley in the music scene.
Well, David Bowie came from Bromley, funnily enough.
That's right.
Rock and roll. David Bowie came from Bromley. And in fact went to the same school as me. He's obviously, he was 10 years older than me, but he was a great example to all of us. One of the good things about Bromley is it's near London. So we could go to London, we could, you know, walk up and down the King's Road, and it was a great period of fashion and creativity in the arts.
Were you walking?
We had hope in those days. Unlike for young people today, my son Sachin is here, I think he just walked out of the back.
No,
actually,
he's right there.
I think he just disappeared when I began to speak, as he
he's
always.
Right there.
Oh.
Right there.
We had hope in those days, and we believed we could achieve things. But when I was a young man, and people would say to me, "What are you going to do?" I would say, "I'm going to be a writer." They would always say to you then, "Yeah, but what are you going to do for a living?" And I have to say, now I'm in my 60s, I can tell you that I made a living from writing my whole life, and I supported my kids. I would like to say this isn't only my own achievement. I would like to say that it's possible for young writers from India, from Pakistan, from Asia, from wherever. It's possible now with the growth of the media for young people to make a living as writers and artists. So it's not such a stupid profession to follow. We don't all have to become dentists, although I would have to say dentists are probably more useful than writers.
So when this session ends, and I hope it never ends, we're going to play a YouTube of the theme song from Buddha of Suburbia that was sung by David Bowie. I always mispronounce his last name, so I have to think of the Bowie part. So David Bowie sang that song, and we'll play that in the end. So you covered a lot in what you just said about writing. Do you think there's something to be said about darkness and coming from a place which is in disaster or crisis and darkness for writers to actually take a stand and say, this is what I'm going to do. This is going to be my vehicle? And I ask this question, Hanif, because there are a lot of young people in the crowd. And I wonder if they understand what an idol you were and are. So, you know, and how they can have the same kind of path.
There are some fantastic writers coming from Pakistan, very, very impressive writers from Pakistan. Of course, Mohsin Hamid, Muhammad Hanif, and of course the great Kamala Shamsi, who are very well known all over the world. But to any young writers in the room, I would say that this is a great country because there are so few stories told about Pakistan and the political, economic, cultural, and religious challenges that you have to live with. And I, for one, would happily read your work and stories. If you're a writer, though, you can find stories anywhere, you know? You could find a story in your kitchen. You can find a story, many stories, in your bedroom. You can find a story on your street. And you can, I wrote a film, My Beautiful Laundrette, which was really about something that happened to me. There was a time in my life when my father despaired of me ever becoming a writer. So he sent me to see a friend of my family who had laundrettes. And this friend of my family used to take me around these bloody awful laundrettes. We used to drive around, he'd say, "That is my laundrette, I own that one." And then he would take me to another laundrette. And after a time, I said to him, "Why are you showing me all these laundrettes? Why do we have to spend the day seeing laundrettes?" He said, "You could work here." He said, "You could run one of these." And my heart really sank, and I realized my father was giving up on me, that he thought, if he can't become a writer, he can run a laundrette. Then I realized you could write a story, write a movie about a guy running a laundrette. You know, you can take any minute, any small, funny story, and you can turn it into something else. So you don't necessarily need the most extraordinary, the most dramatic stories in order to become a writer. You can take a small, funny incident, like a guy doesn't know anything about laundrettes, and there he is running a laundrette with a young skinhead friend of his with whom he falls in love. So it was a love story about two friends running a laundrette. So it's kind of nothing that became something, and the film became very, very successful. So if there are any young writers in the room, if you don't have families who have laundrettes, I'm sure you have families who engage in other kinds of, let's say, absurd activities that will make a good story. So you can begin anywhere as a writer.
So after My Beautiful Laundrette, obviously the laundrettes had a big effect, because then he wrote Buddha of Suburbia, and then in 1995, the Black Album, after which came Intimacy. My goodness, you really were focused on the vagina in Intimacy.
On the what? Vagina.
Are we allowed to say that? Well, I thought I'd put you on the back foot before you put me
You are
on
the only
back.
person in this festival so far who has used the word vagina.
My goodness,
Maniza.
what is that? What is that? Okay, so, and then after that, Gabriel's Gift in 2001, 2003, The Body, and in 2008, Something to Tell You. We've named our session Something to Tell You. Then in 2014, The Last Word, and in 2017, The Nothing. And
I've written a lot.
yes.
I've written loads. It hasn't been, sometimes I wake up in the morning and think, what a terrible man I am, what a wasted life I've led. But actually, I've written a lot. I've also written short stories, essays, TV shows, and movies. And I would say, if you're a young writer in the audience, this is a really good time for young writers.
Yeah.
You know? Mm-hmm. As most of you know, we're living in a time when there's a huge explosion, particularly of TV, with Netflix, Amazon, AMC, HBO, etc., etc. So, and particularly during the COVID, there's a huge demand for TV and TV shows. Yeah. And there are many writers' rooms being set up in the US and the UK, and I'm sure here, India and other countries. So it's a good time for young writers. I've never known a period during my lifetime when there have been so many opportunities for young writers. So I would urge you to get your pens and pencils and laptops out and start telling stories, local stories about your lives, not American stories, nor stories like other people write, but your own local stories, which can be then understood and loved by international audiences.
So I can just imagine somebody walking in to a pub and walking up to a guy named Bill Shakespeare and saying, it's a good time for young writers, you know, you should try writing. Was there ever a bad time for writers? It's always a good time.
When I was a young writer, it was really hard to make a living.
Yeah.
It's really tough to make a living as a writer when I was a kid. I worked in the theatre. Where I really trained as a writer in the UK, I decided to become a writer when I was 14 or 15 years old. My father was a novelist. My uncle Hanif Kureishi, of course, was a writer. He had a column with The Dawn. Many of my other uncles were writers. So I come from a literary family. And my father had many books in his house. He had a huge library. So it was natural for me to become a writer. You know, if I said in my family I want to be a writer, nobody said, oh, you know, you should become a doctor or a dentist or whatever, because it was natural for us to write. And I was very lucky in that sense that everybody in my family was reading and writing. But I trained really as a writer in the theatre.
Yes.
And the theatre is a very good place to learn for writers, because you see your dialogue being said in front of you. Right. By the actors in the rehearsal room, and you hear the lines being said, and you can hear how stupid the lines are, how badly you're writing, and then you cut them and you rewrite them and you revise them and so on. So that was a really good training for me. And then I moved into film, because a company called Channel 4 had just started, and in those days they always had to have one Asian. All the writers were white. Then you usually had one woman. And in those days, because of what we call diversity, I was always the diversity. I am the diversity hire. You know, you go to any company in the US now, if you go on Amazon, talk to somebody on Zoom from Amazon, they always have a black fellow there. And you think, he's the diversity hire. Well, I always used to be the diversity hire. That was my job. I was a diversity token. And I wrote My Beautiful Laundrette, and that's how I got my first job, and then how I started to make a living, and the film became successful, and I could then carry on and get other work.
And then you went on to write, you know, what, a dozen screenplays or more, at least those, that's what I have got in front of me. Out of those, I saw, of course, My Beautiful Laundrette.
Sorry?
Out of the plays...
Put your face in the microphone.
Right there. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I saw My Beautiful Laundrette. I saw Sammy and Rosie Get Laid, My Son the Fanatic, and Venus, and Le Weekend in Paris, and you've written so many more. My Son the Fanatic, it seems like you were the canary down the mine much before people were really on to what was going on in England. And could you talk a little bit about that, and then we'll come to present-day England.
In 1989, as many of you will remember, there was a fatwa against my friend then, Salman Rushdie. And of course, everybody condemned the fatwa, etc., etc. At that time, I began to investigate these young so-called Asian kids, Muslim kids, who had got involved in fundamentalism. And I started to go to the colleges and the schools, and I started to travel around Britain and interview these kids, because their so-called fundamentalism really surprised me. Because my father brought us, me and my sister, he brought us up in the UK because he wanted us to be, my dad used to say, I want you to be English. He said, I want you to be like the English, I want you to fit in here. And suddenly there was a generation of kids who got involved in extreme religion, in radical Islam, This is the 90s. This is obviously long before 9/11 and so on. And I started to interview these kids and write about these kids. And I wrote a short story called My Son the Fanatic. And then I wrote a movie called My Son the Fanatic that was made by the BBC, which was about a Pakistani man and his son, and the son becomes radicalized. And I began to think about why people who had grown up in a relatively free, liberal, open Western democracy would become Islamofascists. And I found this to be a fascinating story for me, and I was one of the, I guess, one of the first people to begin to write about this subject.
Yes,
yeah,
exactly. And that's why I'm calling you that badass, brilliant bard of Britain.
It's not really badass to write about a very interesting political and social...
right, that's not the part where I'm thinking about when I say badass. So let's get to that. How did you begin writing? What were you writing?
I began as a writer when I was at school. I went to a really boring school in South London, and I spent most of my time looking out of the window, dreaming of the future. And one day I thought I would become a novelist. And suddenly I felt free. I thought, now I have a future. You know, in the suburbs, your life is very closed. You know, normally in the suburbs, by the time you're 20, 25, you will have a house, you'll have kids, you'll have settled down. And I thought the future is closing. Then I thought, I'm going to be a novelist. So I began to write. I began to write novels.
But what were you were writing something else as well before that? Before you wrote a novel?
Not when I was 14, no.
No, okay.
No, I was writing, when I was at school, I was the only kid who was brown. I went to a school that was entirely white, and I was the only kid with a name that nobody could pronounce. I'm sure it's happened to some of you here, but nobody could ever pronounce the name Kureishi. And I was the only brown kid, and this was a time, I'm talking about the 1960s, when there was a lot of racism in the UK. And it was very dangerous to go on the street. My dad was frightened, I was frightened, my mum was frightened for us. We were always scared of being beaten up or chased or pursued. And I had a really hard time at school. Every day at school, from the age of 5 or 6 years old, somebody called me a Paki. So I began to think about writing about race. And nobody at that time had written about what became known as the new immigration, which were the generations of Pakistanis and Indians coming to Britain in the 50s, 60s and 70s, and later on, of course, from Bangladesh. So I began to understand that I was in a unique position to tell stories about the new Britain that was emerging, a Britain of immigration and racial change, and these stories had never been told before. So that became material in my first plays. Then I wrote My Beautiful Laundrette, which was, of course, a story about a young Pakistani boy. And then I wrote The Bird of Suburbia. And then after that, other writers began to write about race, about Britain, and this particular conjunction of the empire, and the empire, as we used to say, the empire striking back, which was Britain really in the 80s and 90s and so on. So I was just lucky. I wrote about my dad, and I wrote about race, and I wrote about myself, but I found that I was also writing about something that was, let's say, relatively universal. Right. And that was a good place for me to start as a writer.
Yeah. So, Hanif, as you look at Great Britain, United Kingdom now, what are you seeing? You know, you saw early on this story, My Son the Fanatic, but what are you seeing now? Is there something different happening now? And in Europe as a whole, and of course I'm thinking of this, is it really fascism that's rising, or are we all getting hysterical? What's going on?
It's a very dark time for young people. Funnily enough, my son Sachin, who's speaking today at 6 o'clock, he said to me the other day, he said this wonderful thing. He said, I was born in the mid-50s. He said to me, you were born in the most perfect time in history. He said, the mid-50s, you know. It was a very, very peaceful time. You had a very good free education. I went to university free. You know, now in the UK, you have to pay £9,000 a year to go to university. My parents were very poor. You know, my dad worked in the Pakistan embassy, and his income was very, very low. So I was born in a fortunate time, and also I was born in the time of the Beatles, you know. So there was a huge explosion of British creativity in filmmaking, in fashion, in music. And also it was a great period in politics, because it was a great period of feminism.
Yeah.
It was a great period of anti-racist activity, and a period of anti-fascism. Also a great time for gay people, you know. There was the gay sweatshop, and many gay people at that time became active, and we began to understand that the struggle of gay people, the struggle of women, and the struggle against racism, it was all the same struggle, and what it's called is universalism. You know, we are all minorities living in a majority world, and the struggle of gay people, and the struggle against racism, and the struggle against misogyny and male domination, it was one fight. So it was a really good period to grow up in. I think things are a bit darker now, and later I think my son Sachin tonight will talk about how dark it is for young people. Yeah. Certainly, particularly at a time like war like this, and certainly at a time of real urgency with the problem of climate change.
Right. So do you think it's no longer that way, of lots of minorities getting together and having a universal struggle? Are we in a different space now?
I think the idea of universalism, that one struggle, the struggle for one is the struggle for all, is particularly important. That the struggle against misogyny, of discrimination against women, the struggle certainly on behalf of gay and lesbian and trans people, and so on. This is one fight. This is one fight for against religious domination and against political domination. And we see, for instance, in Europe, certainly in Poland and Hungary, we see right-wing dictators like Viktor Orban and so on, who are using gay and homosexual people as their victims. And if there were any Muslim people there, they would go in for the same thing. Yeah. So I think the recognition that of universal values of the struggle of all minorities is absolutely essential.
Okay. So I'm just going to shift a little bit, because I don't think we can be where we are right now today, sitting here, without talking about the pandemic and how the lockdowns happened, and we're still going through the pandemic. And can I just ask you how that affected you as a writer, and what was it? And I'm just going to take a guess and think that you're a very social person. So what was the effect of the lockdowns on you?
The funny thing to ask, if you ask any writer about the pandemic, they all make the same joke. Actually, I talked to two writers last night. They made the same joke. If you say to a writer, "How was the pandemic for you? What was it like to be isolated?" They all say, "Oh my God, I've been isolated for fucking 35 years." You know, being a writer is a good job, you know, if you want to be a writer, but it's really boring, you know. It's the most boring job in the world. You know what you do? You get up in the morning, you go into a room, you shut the door, you sit down and you sweat all day. You sweat all day, you cry. Eventually blood comes out of your ears. You think you're going mad, you're turning into an insane person. Then you come out of the room at about 5 o'clock and you are completely dazed. That's the life of a writer. So I have to say the pandemic didn't affect me very much. But I think the idea of a global illness is a very interesting metaphor. And I think also during the pandemic, people's relationships really changed. I mean, me and my family, we all live close by and we spend every day together, and we had a really good time. We loved the pandemic. We had a great time. We cycled around the city, the streets were safe, there was no traffic. We spent a lot of time together and so on. But also, of course, people were very frightened. They were very frightened of each other. People got really paranoid. I don't think yet so far there's been very much interesting fiction about the pandemic, you know. Maybe it always takes a while for someone to write a novel or a movie or a story or a TV show about any particular subject. There's always a time lag, you know. But I think in the next few years there'll be some interesting COVID stories and novels, and very funny stories about people being stuck with each other, people particularly who hate each other, etc., who have been locked in with each other for weeks, months, even years. That could be pretty funny as far as I can see.
So Hanif, you write a lot about your dad, about your father, and then you have a book, My Ear to His Heart.
Yeah.
And why is that? And I'll just ask the next part of that question. Do you write about your mom?
I started to write about my dad because my dad was a very funny guy. I mean, he was very funny, he was very amusing, he was very lively, he was very well read, and he was quite a comical character, you know? And I began to write about him because his story was a universal story. He had come from India, came from Bombay, and he came to the UK, and he came to the UK full of hope, and he wanted us to be English. And of course, this was the story at that time in the 50s, 60s, and 70s of immigration, obviously from Pakistan, India, etc., as we talked about already. So his story was not only his story, but his story had become a universal story. And so you know, you can take one small situation as a writer, and it becomes universalized. You can see this, for instance, in a great writer like Chekhov. You know, Chekhov is writing these little local small stories about, you know, marriages and doctors and so on. But everybody here who's ever read a book knows that Chekhov is one of our greatest writers. So you can take a little story like that, set in your kitchen, and you can universalize it. So I wrote about my dad and about his story, about his brothers and about his family, because I could see that I could make this into a bigger thing. I have written about my mum. I wrote a film called The Mother, which is partly about an old woman who takes a young lover. Funnily enough, in the movie, the young lover is played by the guy who became James Bond, Dan Craig, funnily enough. So I have written about my mum, but my mother was a much darker, more complicated figure and more complex. Somebody said to me the other day, someone said to me the other day, everybody in this room, for everybody in this room, the maddest person they will ever meet in their life is their mother. And that really made me laugh, and I thought that was really true because of our intimacy with our mothers, and you realize the craziness of the mother. When I say the craziness, because you're so intimate with the mother, you realize that the craziness of the human being, the irrationality, the strangeness of the human being is in everybody's mother. And the more complex the character, the more difficult they are to write about.
I'm just going to switch again and ask you, you're the commander of the British Empire.
I am.
Right. What does that mean? Do you get a discount at Tesco?
I've got a CBE.
Yeah.
I get a discount in Tesco anyway. Because they've got the Tesco card.
But what does a CBD get you?
It doesn't get you anything. You get a mod. You get when they give you a CBE, you get a medal.
Okay.
It's brilliant.
Yeah.
You get a medal. I've got a medal, and it says on the back, it says this brilliant thing on the back: for God and the Empire. I said they've given me a medal which stands for two things that don't exist. I said, thank you. I said, thank you, Britain. It's a shame that it's given to you that it's part of the considered to be part of the empire, because I was very proud to have been given an award by the state for my services to writing and literature. It's a real shame to me that it's associated with the royal family and all of that stuff. Something that I don't particularly want to be associated with. But I was very proud to have my CBE, but I have to say, you don't get a better seat in a restaurant.
You don't?
No, you don't get nothing.
Okay. We have very little time, and I think people would probably want to ask you a few questions, and I'm hogging all your time. But before I open it up for questions, I have one more question. As I am based in New York, do you have any observations about America, about the United States, what's going on, and as a writer, what do you see that as?
I used to spend a lot of time in the U.S. Around the time of my beautiful laundrette. I was in the U.S. and several of my friends then later on began to move to the U.S. Salman Rushdie, Zadie Smith, Martin Amis, other writers. They all moved to the U.S. because the U.S. was considered to be the center of the world, where all the action is, and also for writers where the money is. You can make a lot of money in writing in America in a way that you can't in the UK. So in the 80s and the early 90s, I spent a lot of time in the US, and I had an agent there and so on. And she said to me, you should stay here and become a screenwriter, and you'll make a lot of money and blah, blah, blah. And I thought about this a lot. And unlike the other writers, I went home. I went back to the UK. I went back to Britain. And I thought, because I want to be a British writer. And that's where my stories are, I can't write American dialogue. I don't understand really how Americans speak. I can pretend to understand how Americans speak, but they don't speak like in the way that I understand English dialogue. And the stories I want to tell come from where I am, from London.
So does that mean you...
So I returned to the UK, and I can walk up my street, and I can go to my shops, and I can walk around my neighborhood and talk to my friends. And every day I would hear more and more stories, stories that I can use and I may write down. So being in my little patch of earth, in my area, I have sufficient material that will last me for the rest of my life. I don't want to go to America for that reason.
Right. So the bubble in my head is, he's not going to come to New York, and I can't be a host. But you've been to Pakistan now several times. Is there a story that's percolating in your head that's based on your more recent experiences here? That could be a yes or no answer.
I would love to write a story set in Karachi. But I'm getting old now. I'm in my decline. It's over for me. You see an old man who is declining, who can barely wake up, and I want to hand over my talent to my kids and to other young people. I would love to write a story set here.
Do it.
Well, I haven't got any ideas. So anybody can see me later. If you've got a good story, Anybody here? I'm sure you have many stories. You can tell me the story. I can write it down, put my name on it.
Okay. I'll tell you a story.
Okay, later.
But later. Now shall we open it up? And before we end the session, after the questions, we will play the music theme from Buddha of Suburbia, which is just fabulous. Any questions?
But if anybody wants to ask any questions, there's the lady there with her hand up. She's very enthusiastic. Up there, there.
And let's have a question.
You already made all the observations, I guess. Huge fan of yours, massive fan. Don't know if you'll be invited back after all the F-bombs and other things which are banned around this place. I had a question to ask you about your uncle Umar Kureishi. I was a huge fan of his. Did his work ever, was he an influence ever for you in any way, shape, or form? Because I did read in when you wrote about the memoir about your father, and how your father's writing was an influence on you, and seeing your father write, and that was a great memoir, by the way. I absolutely loved it. That's one of the reasons why I'm here. But I'm really interested to know your take on you coming from a very literary family, what the influence was, especially of Umar Kureishi.
When I was a kid, I spent a lot of time with my father. There were 12 kids. It was a huge family. And when I was a kid, I spent a lot of time with my uncles, because they would come, and my aunts, they would come every summer to the UK, mostly to watch cricket. And they would spend the summers with us. And they were a very literary family, as well as a great cricket family. And they had a huge influence on me. They had a huge influence on me because they loved sport, they loved jokes, they loved politics, and they loved literature. And my uncle Omar Kureishi, who was a journalist and a cricket commentator, and I think quite well known here, he wrote 3 wonderful volumes of autobiography, which had a big influence on me because it was the story of my family and their lives in India. And in a way, my own father was down. We came from a very grand family in India, and my father, we declined and declined and declined. And my dad ended up in a little suburban house in a kind of rundown suburb just outside London. And the story of this grand family and its decline fascinated me, you know? And being the good son, my job is to elevate the family again. So I saw myself in this narrative. And I came from a family, as you suggest, that always read. And I still read, and my kids read. And so for us in our family, being a writer is a normal thing, is a natural thing, you know? It's not such a strange thing to say, I want to be a novelist. And that really helped me as a young writer, because I was never discouraged, as some, of course, young writers will be. Thank you for your question. Anybody else? Is the lady there?
Is there a question out there?
Yeah, there's a lady there with her hand up.
Back, yeah.
Hi. So we run a library, and what's interesting and somewhat distressing is like the whole concept of book banning. There's so many books we keep that there's an outrage over it because they're whatever considered detrimental to young minds or to the fabric of society. And especially in today's age, which should be liberal, there's so much kind of extreme moral policing of fictional characters as well. So what is your take on the whole concept of book banning that's been, I guess, a concept for centuries?
Well, as you know, most of the most interesting books that have ever been written have been banned. So this is a great thing. I tell you why this is a great thing, because it means that books are dangerous. Of course, I was involved in the Satanic Verses affair. One of the sources, of course, for Islamophobia in the UK, when we saw fanatics in Bradford banning and burning a book by a great writer, Salman Rushdie, and it was horrific to see these fanatics and lunatics setting fire to a book of a very important writer. We also know that Ulysses of James Joyce was banned. We also know that books by Nabokov, Flaubert, Henry Miller, D.H. Lawrence, and so on, these books have been banned and prosecuted for obscenity at some kind of a time or another. So it's interesting. These books have been banned, they've been burned, they've been attacked, etc., but they're still around, and they come back, and literature survives. So you could burn the satanic verses in Bradford, but people can still read it if they want to read it, or they can read Midnight's Children or whatever. These books will survive.
In fact, people will want to read them even more. The best way to market a book is to ban it. Hum to dua karte hain.
I've often thought of setting fire to one of my own books. In a local town square, holding up the Buddha of Suburbia, getting some matches and setting fire to it in order to get more publicity for myself.
Exactly.
So you can ban books, but you can't destroy them forever. They come back. And you think that a great novel like Lolita, you know, was banned in some countries at some time. But you can read Lolita today. So, you know, writing survives despite all the efforts to destroy both writers and books.
The question is that there's an internal censor within South Asian writers, especially amongst women. You can't have a female Philip Roth or Hanif Kureishi here, because you could have a Kamala Das who wrote some poetry for which she became notorious. But women can't write about, I mean, she mentioned the B word in the beginning, but they can't talk about it. They can't go there behind the parda, if you know what I mean.
Well, you have to be brave, don't you?
Yes, but then, you see, because we're a communal society, people know she's the one or he's the one who's written about so-and-so. I mean, Philip Roth has written all that, it's in his book, but he's not associated with what he's written about in his book. But here, there's a sort of censoring within writers. Look at any of the novelists, women writers, etc. They don't go there. They might mention it, you know, what happened and the consequences of it. What? I'm sorry. Oh, sorry. Okay. Do you see what I'm saying? And I think that's a huge, it's hobbling people. It's crippling lots of writers.
It's a very good question. It's a question that I can't answer.
Yeah.
It's a question you have to answer. I'd like to see a nice Pakistani woman writer writing a book called Vagina. I think I would read that. I would look forward to that.
I bet. But,
Naomi Klein wrote that.
But can you now weave into your answer the writing of what's called pornography?
Well, Philip Roth, this lady here was talking about Philip Roth. When he began writing and when he wrote Portnoy's Complaint, he got into a lot of trouble.
He did.
The local rabbi denounced him. I'm not talking here about writing pornography. I'm talking about writing freely.
Yes,
I'm talking about writing about what is at the center of our lives, which is our sexuality. And I imagine the good lady here is talking about female sexuality and how it may be written about. There's a very interesting French writer called Leila Slimani, who is from Morocco, who writes about Moroccan immigrants in France and their sexuality. So there are people who are beginning to break these taboos, but in the end you have to be brave, don't you? You have to be brave and you have to say. Speaking is one of the most difficult things that anybody can do. Speaking to your friends, speaking in your family, etc. I met a young writer last night, a Pakistani writer. He's written a book, which he sent to me. I haven't read yet. He's written a book. He said, I wrote this book, and he said, now nobody in my family speaks to me. I said, you must have written a good book then, because I said, if you write a book and your family are still speaking to me, you must have done something wrong. I said, anybody who speaks may or may not cause offense to somebody else. The point of writing isn't to cause offense, it's not to hurt people. The point of writing is to speak your truth, you know? And when you speak your truth, somebody will come up to you and say, you spoke my truth as well. So come on, women, get your pens out, get writing, be brave, and say what you have to say. And let's open up this world to more democracy, to more conversations. I'll read the first chapter.
Any other questions out here? There's one right here. We've got maybe 5 more minutes.
So in your film, My Beautiful Laundrette...
Can you put the mic closer to you?
In My Beautiful Laundrette, there is a very funny and memorable line when Omar's uncle, the Saeed Jaffri character, is evicting a tenant, and he's an Afro-Caribbean tenant, and he appeals to the uncle on the basis of sort of black solidarity. He's a Pakistani, he's a brother, and the retort is, I am not a professional Pakistani, I'm a professional businessman.
Yeah.
And this resonated with a lot of people. Do you, that he wasn't expected to speak for his race or his, you know, do you sometimes feel, or have you had the experience of being expected to speak for a certain group and fighting against that, but now that you're older, perhaps wanting to do that, like speak for a certain generation or a certain group of writers or post sort of empire immigration?
It's a very interesting question, because when my my movie My Beautiful Laundrette opened in New York, I was there at the time, and every Sunday there was a huge crowd who gathered, and they were called the Pakistan Action Committee, and they would walk around the cinema with their placards. And they wanted to, my movie, My Beautiful Laundrette, they wanted it to be banned. And I used to go and walk around with them and talk with them. And I said to them, what is it you don't like about this movie? And they said it's about homosexuality. And I said, and they said to me, there are no homosexuals in Pakistan. They said that you've got this completely wrong. There is not one single homosexual in Pakistan, and you have showed us as being homosexual. I said, I'm sure there are homosexuals in Pakistan. I said, last time I was there, I was fondled very enthusiastically. I was fondled very enthusiastically at least twice. I've still got it, baby, I said. But I am not a representative of anybody. I don't belong to anybody. I write the stories that I write. I write about Pakistanis, I write about men, women, English people, gays, straights, you know, old, young, etc., etc. But a writer doesn't speak for anybody but him or herself, you know. We speak in our own voice. I'm not a union representative. If I write a story about a Pakistani or an Englishman, I'm not writing about all Pakistanis. I'm not writing about all Englishmen. I'm just telling this little story about something that happened, and it may or may not resonate with other people. But you know, the guess that we make as artists, as writers, is that our little story, it may resonate with somebody, it may reach somebody else. And you call that union of writer and reader a moment of truth. It's a beautiful moment of truth. So no, I don't speak for anybody. In fact, I don't even speak for myself. You know, I write from my unconscious. It comes out as it comes out, and often I don't recognize, I don't know who it is speaking or whatever. It's quite an organic thing.
Well, you may not think you speak for anyone, but not even for yourself, but your writing certainly resonates with so many. And I think we're going to end the session now and tell you, before you go, we have something to tell you, that we love your writing. And
well, thank you. Thank you very much.
And now I think we're going to show the clip. Can we show the clip, please? the YouTube from the Buddha of Suburbia. It should have been cute.